Uncle Ed's farm down at Jennings, Louisiana. I started hitchhiking, which was not a very well known thing to do at that time because there weren't that many cars, but there were a few motor buses and a few things like that. So I was going north. I wanted to head to the northwest. The nearest main road went straight west, but I didn't want to go that direction. So I stayed on this road, which is more or less through the swamp area. And I walked and walked and walked, and a few cars went by, but nobody was stopping to pick me up. I learned later that there were a few chain gangs or work gangs around in that part of the swamp, and when somebody would escape from them, they'd of course have to walk on the only high spots, which were the grades of the roads. So nobody was stopping to pick up anybody that was walking along them roads. Well, I walked pretty much all day, and I was getting pretty tired and pretty hungry. And you'd see a snake crawling over the road once in a while, so I was getting a little bit nervous and trying to figure out how I was going to get somebody to stop. And there were a few buses would go by, and I'd wave a $5 bill at them, but they wouldn't pay no attention and just keep right on going. And I decided that I'm going to have to do something pretty desperate to get me a ride. So couldn't think of much of any way to stop a car or a bus. So I started watching for a rock along the road, and those rocks weren't very plentiful either. There weren't too many. But I finally found a rock about half as big as my fist. So the next bus that came along going north, and I could see he wasn't going to stop, so I threw the rock and went through the windshield. Well, the guy stopped all right. He stopped, picked me up, and hauled me into the next town, which was quite a few miles. I guess I would have been walking a long ways. And of course, I'm in a lot of trouble. They throwed me in jail there overnight. And I finally convinced them to call my Uncle Ed down there at Jennings, and they finally called him, and he did vouch for me, and it cost me a $20 fine, and I was on my way. That was one of my trips to jail. And one night when I was traveling from farm to farm, one place I stayed at, they had me sleeping in the house. Now I did my banking in the bib pocket of my uh, blue overalls, and I had learned to be very stringent, very tight with my money. So I was always conscious of having that in my bib pocket of my overalls. This one farm we stayed at, I had to sleep in the same bed with one of the other bindle stiffs. When I went to bed that night, I was thinking about that money that I had in the bib pocket of my overalls, and I'm not sure to this day yet whether I got to dreaming or whether it actually was happening, but I dreamed that this guy was reaching up over me to pick up my overalls, which I had stuffed partially under my pillow. So I'd haul off and smacked him, and there was a big commotion. The guy was hollering, "Hey, hey, what'd you hit me for?" Big whoop-de-doo, waking up everybody in the house. So I said, "Yeah, I hit you." "Well, what for?" And I said, "Well, I was dreaming." So what kind of fitfully went to sleep then, but the following night that guy decided he'd rather sleep in the barn instead of sleeping with me, and which was all right with me too, but he did have himself a pretty nice black eye. Then we would we would sometimes gather when I'd ride the rails between towns. We'd gather at the hobo camps, or the jungle camps, they used to call them, in the edges of the railroad centers. And all the hobos would gather out there, and everybody would go out and scavenge or scrounge up something. We'd cook in tin pans and tin cans, syrup buckets, or whatever, and make up some meals. And it was in one of these camps that I one time run on to Will Rogers. Didn't know who he was at that time, but got to know about who he was later. And another guy I met in one of those camps was Joe Maphis. And Joe Maphis and Will Rogers and I had gone to Shreveport, Louisiana one time and played on the old Louisiana Hayride, which was a radio station, an amateur show they put on, and just about anybody could get in there. All you had to do was show up. This was in the year 1928. I stopped by home. My folks were still living down there in southern Minnesota, and I stopped by home on my trek through, and while I was there, my baby brother Glenn was born. That was in August of 1928. Then when we'd go back south again, I'd follow the harvest all the way up into Canada, North Dakota. And one year when I was up in North Dakota, well, I guess that was the same year yet, 1928. And it was state fair time. And the rains that came, which wasn't too common in North Dakota, but it had rained and rained, so we couldn't thrash. So a bunch of us went to Fargo to the state fair, and the weather wasn't very good for a fair. The crowds weren't doing too well, and there was one guy there that had a chuck-a-luck game, kind of a run-down, dilapidated setup. And so I'd got to sleeping in his little lean-to tent that he had set up with a plank in front for his oilcloth with the chuck-a-luck numbers on it and a little cylinder, and then he just had a canvas awning he'd drop down to the front. So I'd slept in there with him a night or two, and he kept trying to sell out to me, and of course I never let on that I had any money. And first he wants $1,000, and then he's getting down to less all the time, and finally it was on the last day of the fair anyhow, was going to be the following day, and the guy was broke. He didn't have a dime left, so I finally said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $100 for the whole outfit. You had an old Terraplane car and a four-wheel trailer, and you also had some other bookings. So after a certain amount of haggling, he decided that he'd just well sell out because he wasn't going to make anything there anyhow. Well, the next day was the last day of the fair, and we got up in the morning. It was still drizzling a little bit, but by 7 o'clock the sun had came out, and it's developing into a pretty nice day. So I opened up the front of my place there, and the crowds kept growing, and by the end of that day, late that night, when I finally buttoned up, I had made about $1,200 on my chuck-a-luck. So I said, hey, this is for me. I don't think I want to go back to thrashing anymore. So the following day, took me some time to load up. I hadn't done this before, to take this tent and the equipment all apart, make it fit on that four-wheel trailer made out of an old Model T Ford running gear. But I finally got it loaded, get the old Terraplane started up, and drove out of the fairgrounds. By that time, the old terraplane was smoking and steaming, and that car was on her last leg. She was completely shot. I'd got down on a road down there and had gone a short distance when the old terraplane just heaved her last. She just gave up and died right there alongside the road. Well, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do then, but I had looked, and I'm right smack in front of a Whippet garage, and they had a brand new model Whippet sitting there, a cabriolet, which is kind of a coupe with the little curved iron bars on the side by the window. And then they were bragging about four-wheel brakes, which they were one of the first cars that did. But they were mechanical brakes, but they did have four-wheel brakes, which most cars didn't have. So I went in there, and after a certain amount of haggling, I bought that brand new Whippet with the proposal that they take the hitch off my old terraplane and put it on this Whippet, which they did. Took the rest of the day to do that. And the following day, I was on my way in style. I got me a brand new Whippet. I'm a big wheel. I'm a big businessman, and I had a few more things to learn yet. But I started south. The next booking that this guy had was at Bellingham, Minnesota. Well, I was going along the road there by Ortonville and along the lake road. The road was quite high up from the lake. You looked down to your right, and there was quite a slope dropping down toward the lake. And to the left was a high bank, and there were some driveways coming down out of that. And so I was going along with this four-wheel trailer. I suppose I was clipping along at 35 or 40 miles an hour, and the kids came down out from one of them driveways, which were coming down pretty steep, down onto the gravel road. Well, I saw the first one come, and I slowed down a little bit, and then I saw the second one coming, and so I'm going to turn inside so I can pass him to the left as he made a loop and turned to go the same way I was. And then the third one came, and then we were right close. There wasn't much time to do anything, so I just cut the car over to the right. I guess I wasn't thinking clearly. We went down over that side bank, and then we rolled and rolled and rolled. I don't remember how far we rolled, because when I woke up, I was in the hospital there in Ortonville. And it was a while before I got out of there. When I did, I went back to where my new car and my trailer was, and all that had rolled several hundred feet all the way down below the lake, and it was pretty well stripped out. There wasn't much down there, so I just walked away from the whole caboodle. There wasn't enough there for me to salvage. And then in 1929, I'd gone back down to Louisiana, and I'd worked on the river boats. When I worked my way back south, I got a job in the river boats there, and I met a couple guys in them river boats. So one by the name of Red Baker, and the other one by Red Elzell. Well, these guys kind of looked out for me. I was the punk on the riverboat, and I was kind of getting a lot of dirty work that really wasn't supposed to be mine, and I was reserving this a little bit. Of course, the new kid on the boat, the old hands had to kind of try pushing me around a little bit, and I just wasn't really built to take too much of that stuff. And so I was trying to
got into a shoving match with one of the guys on the deck one day, and some of the other deckhands had moved up and was gonna maybe shove me around between a bunch of them. But these two guys, they said, "Hey, let's keep it even. Let's keep it man to man." So they kept the rest of the crew off my back, and we had a pretty good go there. Me and this guy that was going to bully me around. Well, I guess like I always was, I was fighting scared. I was younger than he was, and I guess he wasn't any smaller, but I was younger than him, and a little bit desperate. So I come out of that fight in pretty good shape. I give him a pretty good beating, but me and these two boys then, we were pretty good pals. So anyhow, we went on down and started in Louisiana again, come up through Kansas, up through Nebraska, and went on clear on up into North Dakota and finished up our harvest up there. Then it came back. I stopped down at home again, down in southern Minnesota. Well, this was in the fall of 1929. In fact, it was late in the fall. It was just about corn picking time, and here Dad was having an auction sale. He was going to move up near Browns Valley. Well, I knew where that place was. I had got acquainted there in Browns Valley. In fact, I had met your Grandpa Pete Newbridge, your father-in-law, there, and I didn't know it at that time, but we'd had a big old rowdy doll, which Browns Valley is famous for not being very cordial to strangers at that time. Was after trying you out, so they did that. So we had a big circle made in the corner. The fight was going on, and the guy was betting on me, bet $25 on me. He had a guy, and I did come out pretty good. I guess I would declare the winner with it. And this big heavy guy said, "Hey, come on over here to the restaurant, and I'll buy you a supper." Really was too hot and bothered then to have a supper, but I said, okay, I would have a bowl of soup and whatnot. So I did go over to the restaurant with him, and we had a bowl of soup. And anyhow, that's how I first met up with Browns Valley. When we went down there and found out Dad was having a sale in the fall, it was kind of a pleasant fall. We'd finished the harvest up in North Dakota, and I hadn't gone up into Canada, so I suppose it was late September when I got back down to Minnesota where Dad lived, and found out he was having that sale. Well, I stayed there with the auction with him, and then he'd rented what they called an immigrant car. It's a box car, and you'd rent it, and you'd go and load all your goods and stuff into that car, and then you could travel with the car that went up by the rails. So we had a couple of horses that Dad was going to bring along, and a few extra good cows, milk cows. So we had 2 horses, and we had 4 cows. I guess we had 3 horses. There was a son of a wolf on there too. And we rode this train, which was quite an adventure. If I remember right, it took us about 5 days to go from Lismore, Minnesota, and we started out on a rock island and went up through Pipestone and then wrinkled off through Maynard and over to Wilmer. Then we got on the Great Northern. We switched to the Great Northern and we went up to Morris, and then we took the old local west from Morris to Broomsley, where we unloaded. And then we got there, we unloaded the boxcar, and I saddled up the saddle horse and drove them cows, and Dad hitched up a team, the other team in a wagon, and we went out to the farm there, but it was rented up there near Beardsley, between Beardsley and Bronze Valley. It's right on the county line there. Then I went back down to Lismore then, where Dad had moved from, and he had a big corn crop going there. And when I before I moved away, the banker, Lismore, had bought all the corn and he bought it in the field. So I took over the job picking corn there for him for 20 cents a bushel. I had to furnish my own team and wagon. Well, my sister Blanche and brother-in-law Mel lived about a mile and a half from that place, so I got a team and wagon from Mel and stayed there at Blanche's and Mel's, and I picked corn. Used to shoot pheasants and big skunks. Once in a while, Uncle Mel would come over and help me. And it was all in all, it was a pretty good winter. But in the later part of October, I think it was, when the big bust occurred. All of a sudden, everything went boom. I was through picking corn already. So it didn't affect my job picking corn, but the bank, they didn't do too well on the corn. I don't know what they paid per acre for planting in the field, but when the big bust came, all of a sudden the prices of everything was just no good at all. It just wasn't in the market. Farm produce or corn or all that stuff. So I started back down Swells again, but before I got down there, before I went south, I found out that well, I guess this was in the spring. The next spring, I had started back going south, but then the drought had started. Then I get down to Louisiana, and I found out that the rice harvest was just no good down there. There just wasn't any. And so I started moving on back up north again. I was in a rodeo once in a while. I do whatever I could find to do and make $1 here and there. But there wasn't too many. And it was the start of the Ghost Bowl. So I didn't do too well in the year 1930. I came back up north and rode in a few rodeos and did a little boxing. And then I'd work for my cousin, my uncle, Harvey out on the farm out in South Dakota. I worked out there for a while, the late summer into the winter, but I broke horses for walked out there. I got just to my education. I guess you might say I was going to school about that time. And I got up into Fargo, and I had to have a guy up there. He was some kind of a promoter, and he signed me up to box quite a prominent fighter out of in North Dakota, but with my age, I had to claim I was somewhere else. So he signed me up for the contract. I was to fight this guy for 15 rounds out in North Dakota. But I was using a different name. I guess I won't mention the name. Maybe still on a warrant in North Dakota. But we were out there, and I didn't have any really formal training, but I had a lot of training in the alleys and rough house brawls and all this sort of thing, and I'd learned a long time ago to pace myself. And, it was better to hit than get hit. So maybe that's all of education you really need, because I had gloves on before, so I knew somewhat what it was all about. But after about 6 or 7 rounds with prominent fighters that I was fighting, he knew, and I knew that he knew, that I could put him away anytime I wanted to. So I just more or less treated him. I just having a good time. And well, at the end of 15 rounds, I didn't put the guy away, or could have, but I didn't put him away, and he was on to him. Boy, so of course they gave him the decision, which didn't bother me too much. I knew in my own mind, and he knew, was that he wasn't the best man in the ring. So when I went to the back room where I was supposed to get paid, 4 guys sitting in there, and they shut the door behind me. They had the cash receipt, in the box, and they said, we're on to a problem here. We can't pay you because you're not who you claim to be. Well, I was a little hot on the collar then, and I said, well, I had $2,000 some home, and it was money, and I was pretty plain to these people that I wanted my money. And they weren't going to give it to me, so I figured, well, no point in standing around talking about it, so I picked out one of the guys that they were eyeballing. He was supposed to be the muscle man of the goal to keep things honest in there, so I moved over there close to him, so I just started one down by the floor and come up and reached in and laid him out. And I picked up the cash box and counted out $2,400. And nobody was challenging me, so I stuck the money that I had coming in my pocket and went out the door. So I knew that when we get outside the door, they're going to be hollering, crop, crop. So I'd kind of cut from the railroad yards. Then I said, well, what they're going to expect me to do is go down the railroad and ride the freights all over. So I'd made a big loop out there north of Mandan and curled around me a bit. Traveling most of the night, I guess. And anyhow, I didn't quit traveling nights and then sleep out in the daytime and eat wherever I could till I was down in South Dakota, and I figured I'd got rid of the state of North Dakota. But I suppose there's a warrant out there yet for the guy that took that money away from them people. No, well, this time there were soup swarming all over, but I wasn't too much interested in anything like that, so I stopped back near Bisley where Dad lived, and I had accumulated some money. Even in them historical times where I had accumulated some money for it, left my money there with Dad, told him that Dad had been keeping his money in the house all winter, and waiting to see which banks were suitable enough to put his money in, and then by spring he decided that the Barrington Bisley was a safe barracks. So I dropped off $4,500 there with Dad and told him to put it in the bank with his money. So Dad did that. He finally decided that was a good bank, and he had to start getting some shoes and stuff together to put in the crop up there. And you put the money in the bank on a Wednesday, and Saturday the bank went closed. You folded it up, so God was pretty bitty about trusting any banks. So that stuff was rough days. Of course, we never got much. I think he wound up just like about 7 cents on the dollar of all the money that was in there. Well, I cut wood or trapped. I was on the actor cutting wood in the woods off where I had struck an axe right through my foot, and I was out in the woods all alone. I was out there north of Browns Valley, and I was cutting wood for a guy by the name of Lawrence Andrews. Lawrence Andry, I guess, where they pronounce it. Well, I knew I'd cut my foot pretty bad, so I put a tourniquet on it. I knew I had at least 2 more hours to walk before I was out of the woods. So I put a tourniquet on my ankle, filled my boot up with snow, and I'd walk until I foot was pretty numb. Then I'd lay down and put my foot up in the air against a tree, and then release the tourniquet, and then the blood would gush. So I made it down to a house there. It's where John Spindler lived on the farm. John Spindler and his wife went home, and I went in the house, and of course I'm bleeding quite a bit, and I can feel that I'm getting a little woozy. I'm going to have to do something about this. So I found the needle in wood and the barrel, and I guess I had blood all over the house. I set one of the old wall mirrors on a chair, and I laid down there at the bottom of my foot, and boy, I could see really gashed open, so I don't have much of a chance unless I can sew it up. So I did. I sewed my foot up on the bottom, and sewed her up on the top, and closed it up. By this time, boy, I was really getting woozy from loss of blood, and for me, there was up, and I could see now it wasn't seeping like I was. I packed it tight with rags. And then I called on the telephone. I called, and old Dr. Burns and Brown Ryan, him and his nurse Helen Thorne, they drove out there to the farm and picked me up in his car. He cauterized that right away with carbolic acid. I don't know if you people ever knew anything about that. But I can tell you this, it burns like raw. And you squeal a little when it happens. I guess he figured that it was necessary to stop the blood because I was pretty sick for a while from just from the loss of blood. But I did manage to heal up. Hobbled around there most of the winter, and I don't know what's getting into the days. This is the days of old John Dillon, Bonnie and Clyde, the Carpus gang, and old Capone. These was really tough times, and when tough times come along, you get a lot of crime racketeers, a lot of bank robbing and rough stuff going on. People couldn't accept the fact that no money, and so they get a little bit desperate, I guess. I did a little fishing and skinned dead cows, pulled wool off a dead sheep, and all this sort of good stuff. Trying to make a buck now and then, but my folks were having a pretty rough time. The bank had gone broke with all of their money, and then they tried to get stuff together to put a crop in, and the drought was so bad that they wasn't raising much crop. In 1930 and 31, 32 did get a little bit of crop. But in the summer then of 1932, I decided to go back down to southern Minnesota where I could do the farm job because there was a little bit of moisture down there, and they did have a little bit of crop. So I went back down to southern Minnesota to Bismarck, and I worked for a farmer out there during the summer, and had a lot of thoughts going through my mind, and a lot of dwelling on what life was all about, and come to the conclusion that people had just got too far away from the Lord, so I would maybe better do something about that myself, because I was sure that I was no saint. And my Uncle John was a minister down there in Sioux City, and my grandmother lived down there in Sioux City, so I talked to John and Grandma when they'd been up to Minnesota for a visit during the summer, and John kind of got me interested in going back to school down there to maybe be a preacher. So I went to the harvest in 1932, and the school was starting. I went down to Sioux City and picked up a room there at my grandmother's place, and enrolled in junior high school out there, and was going to take all 4 years of high school in 1 year, and decided going to Grace Methodist. Well, the pay on that farm job wasn't great. If I remember right, I was $35 a month, so you can readily see I didn't have much money saved up to go to school. And what money I'd had before that, I lost it, and I'd give some to my folks to help them out. So I discovered that I could go down to Riverside Athletic Club every Friday night. I could get a fight down there. I could box. It wouldn't make very much, maybe $2 a round. At the most I'd make was $6 to $8. But I soon found out that I stayed there and fill in for guys that didn't show up, or it better not be known as a bruising fighter. So you had to be kind of cagey. I had to fight just enough to protect myself, but not enough to really win, to guarantee that I'd have a fight every Friday night. Well, this was working out fairly well. And while I was going to school down there, I was going to Grace Methodist, and started getting into some pretty hot discussions. And I'd come to that part of the scriptures there where in Matthew 16, where Christ said to, when Peter, who do you say I am? And first he'd asked the other apostles, and some of them said that he was Elijah, and some of the other prophets come back to life, John the Baptist. And he turned to Peter, and Peter said, Peter, who do you say I am? And Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, the Messiah. And so Christ had turned to him and said, I give to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And then later on in Matthew, he said, now you go forth and you teach all nations, and I'll be with you all days, even unto the consummation of the world, and the gates of hell will not prevail against you. Well, in this Methodist seminary, they couldn't give me any bona fide explanation of what that all meant. It was all so hazy and far in the sky. And then I'd read a little Bible history, and I'd find out that the Bible hadn't really been put together until 400 years after Christ was crucified and Peter was given the keys. So I come to the conclusion that the Methodist Church definitely couldn't be the one. And while I was troubled about that in my mind, and I was running home one night, that's the way I did all my training, was just I run wherever I wanted to go. I never took a streetcar or a car or anything. And I was running home one night after we'd had a real stormy session, and I'd about decided that I just can't go back there. I can't go along with their doctrine. They're not true. They're off the base. So, and I had gone by this Catholic church, and I was running by there. It must have been about midnight when I was running down the sidewalk, and I saw in the window with the light turned on, and in the study there was a priest sitting in there. So, just on the spur of the moment, I took a turn and went in the driveway and punched the bell, and the priest came to the door, and I told him what was things that was troubling me, and he invited me in. And we were still there when the sun came up, and the scales was removed from my eyes. I see then what the New Testament and the church are one and the same thing. You cannot separate the two. You can't take the Bible and the church as being separate.
the church wrote the Bible, and they put it out as a textbook, and sometime after the year 400. So to take that Bible then and interpret that the way you think it ought to be, and say, no, this is all the truth I need is the Bible, you're way off base, because you got to have the church with that Bible, or the Bible is meaningless. So anyhow, this was pretty well fixed in my mind, and that bore me up quite well for the rest of my days. And now it was in the fall, late in the fall of 1932, and my older brother Elmer and my mother and Dad and the whole family had got sick. At first they diagnosed it as having Malta fever, and then it was sometime late in the fall, I guess it's written in our family book, the date, when my brother finally died. By that time they discovered that they had typhoid fever. So I went home for the funeral, and then my Uncle Bill was going to stay there with my dad for a while, and Squint in the meantime had got married, and he was going to stay home, him and his wife, and help Dad out there. Well, so I went back to Sioux City and was going to go to school, but it was sometime in the cold part of the winter, and I had finally got a letter from Squint, and he said, I said I'd better come home, that he couldn't stay there anymore, and there was just too much work for one guy, and that he had to get out, start finding a home for him and Bess. So I can understand that. So I quit school, and I went on up home to help care for the sick, and I tell you, I had myself a job. We were milking all them cows, and they still hadn't taken the condemn off of these cows for Malta fever, so you'd milk all these cows by hand, and then you'd have to dump the milk. And of course I needed money, and Dad had a grain full of rye, so one day I loaded up a triple box wagon load of rye and took a team and went down to Browns Valley and was going to sell some rye to raise a little bit of money. And I get down there, and the guy in the elevator said, there's no price quoted on rye. It isn't worth anything. Well, I was pretty desperate about that time. I mean, I needed money, and I had sick people, and I had a bunch of bills, and I needed groceries. So many things I needed, and no money. So I drove down out of the elevator, and I was sitting there trying to make up my mind what I was going to do, and the guy in the elevator walked down, and he said, I know you got a rough time out there where what you're trying to do, so I'll tell you what, I'll give you 4 cents a bushel for that rye. Well, I probably had 75 bushels of rye on that wagon, so you can imagine what 4 cents a bushel wouldn't amount to very much. So I said, you go to hell, I'll bottle it. And started up my team and was driving off, and then when I thought about that, I said, well, that's the first smart thing I've said all day. So I drove uptown. I didn't know anybody in Browns Valley, but I went into what was the Medbury store. I drove in the alley behind the place and tied my team up, and I went in there and I talked to Lou Medbury. And I told him what my problems were and what I had in mind, and that I didn't know a thing about it. I didn't know how to make whiskey, but I had a grainer full of rye out there, and I had to move it somehow or other, and I had to raise some money. And he laughed, and he said, I'm not doing any business either. People don't have any money. I can't make any. So he said, I'm going to gamble on it. I'm going to go along with you. And then he told me what I'd need. He said I'd need some oak barrels, and I'd need some yeast, and I'd need sugar. So we went down the basement, and we rolled 6 vinegar barrels up out of the basement, loaded them on top of the wagon, and put 10 pounds of sugar and a bag of yeast in each one of those barrels, and I took off for home. He told me who to go see to learn how to make good whiskey, so I drove right down through the main street of Browns Valley, and of course everybody looks out there and they see a wagon load of rye with oak barrels and sugar and yeast. Everybody knows what I'm going to do, so they all start hollering and laughing and, hey, when's it ready? Let us know, and all these sort of things. So I took the stuff home and went over to see the guy that Lou Medbury told me about, and